Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of the Cedarville Stories podcast. I'm Mark Weinstein, and today on the program, I'm joined by Christen Price, Senior Legal Counsel for the National Center on Sexual Exploitation in Washington, D.C. With a career dedicated to combating human trafficking and sexual exploitation, Christen works at the intersection of law and advocacy, shaping legislation, supporting survivors, and advancing justice. She previously worked as a Department of Justice and Alliance Defending Freedom attorney. After graduating from Cedarville University, she went on to earn her Juris Doctorate from Georgetown University School of Law. Let's go to my conversation with Christen Price on this week's Cedarville Stories podcast. Christen, thanks for joining me today on the Cedarville Stories podcast. It's great to have you on the program. And when I was putting together the program, I needed to do some research. I had some natural resources to talk to. I talked to your dad at Patterson Park Church. So you come from a large family, many siblings. Many of them, if not all of them, have come through Cedarville. I know not all of them, but most of them. I'd love to hear your story, how you got connected to Cedarville. How did Cedarville become the school that you decided to pursue your undergrad degree?
I think it was mostly just from growing up primarily in the area. When I was really small, we had Cedarville students over to our house all the time. They were my babysitters. They would come for Sunday dinner. So Cedarville has always just kind of been there. And I am the oldest of seven, so right. I was the first one of us to go to Cedarville.
And you mentioned that a lot of Cedarville people would come to your family house for for lunch after church, right? Well, who doesn't? I mean, your parents are always inviting people over. Isn't that true?
This is true. This is very true.
It's a great environment. So when you think back to your high school days and you're looking at colleges, obviously you're very smart, you're very bright. You wouldn't go to Georgetown Law School if you weren't, even Cedarville for that matter. What stood out to you about Cedarville and why that was a place for you to come?
Well, I think for just in all candor, my parents really, specifically my dad, really wanted Cedarville.
Okay.
So to be totally honest, that's kind of more how it came about. But I am really thankful, particularly for being able to do the scholar semester in Oxford, which was like incredibly formative for me, the CCCU program, and just being able to study philosophy, which was my major, in a Christian context, was challenging and formative in ways like I could not have anticipated or expected or planned for at 18.
How did that Oxford experience really impact you, though?
Well, it was my first encounter with any kind of liturgical tradition. So I went to Evensong at St. Paul's Cathedral in London, and I just had this image of Anglicanism and kind of high church services as just being very stiff and cold and like dead. And the whole thing was scripture, and it was stunningly beautiful. And I would go to Evensong, which is a combination of evening prayer and night prayer that is sung in a lot of the colleges and cathedrals in Oxford, which was very, very moving. And I actually have been attending an Anglican church now for I think 15 years. But it's very much a result of that time in Oxford. And I think the other thing was just giving me a love for independent research. So much of the work that you do there is just on your own in the library with a book and a notebook. And to this day, it's my preferred way of doing. I don't really do as much legal research, but if I'm writing something that's more academic, that's how I like to research and prepare.
Okay. Drawing your attention that way, how did you come aware of the need to defend people who are being exploited sexually? Where did you learn that from? Did you see that growing up? How did that get on your radar?
It's kind of curious in a way, because I would say I didn't really have any awareness of it growing up.
Yeah.
But looking back, actually, I kind of did. Amy Carmichael, missionary to India, was a big heroine of mine. And she went and rescued girls, tiny, like little girls from essentially sex trafficking in the forced, in the temple prostitution system. And I remember being 11 years old and reading it in Sunday school and thinking, wow, I want to do that, but there's no way that's still happening. And I realized just how wrong I was when I was at Cedarville, I was procrastinating, trying to avoid doing homework or something. And so I started reading random things in the library, and I happened across one of IJM's, like maybe an article in Christianity Today or something on the shelf. And then I ended up reading the account of how they had completely turned around the just blatant open system of child sex trafficking in Cambodia in one town over a relatively short amount of time, just by prosecuting people, just by putting a few people in jail. It completely shifted the balance of power and the incentive structure. And so then I started just reading everything I could, whether it was on domestic violence, sex trafficking, child marriage, pornography, like many of these different kind of overlapping issues.
Christen, professionally, your experience is noteworthy. When I researched all what you've done, who you've worked for Alliance Defending Freedom, focusing on the First Amendment law. Now you're focused on sexual exploitation and those factors with the National Center on Sexual Exploitation. When you look back on your career, 14-year career so far, how have you seen God leading you each step of the way to where you are today?
I think, it's funny how looking back, the pattern is so clear when in the moment you're often just taking the next step or taking a step in faith and you don't really know where it's going to go. I would say the clearest thing that I see looking back really is the way that I ended up in my current position. Because when I was at Cedarville, I knew that I wanted to do anti-sex trafficking work. Okay. And it's not easy to get into. I figured I'd have to become a prosecutor at some point. And I didn't really know that there was a way to do it as a civil litigator through lawsuits or anything like that. And one day I was thinking about it. I was still working at ADF, and I just kind of sketched out, here are the kinds of cases I would love to bring if I had my own firm and money wasn't an object, and I could just bring the kinds of cases I thought would really change things in a systemic way. And so I was just making my kind of daydream plan early in 2019. And then in fall of 2019, I reached out to a friend of mine at the National Center on Sexual Exploitation, who was a researcher. I had decided I really should at least start talking to people who are in the field I'd like to be in and think about how I could maybe make that transition from First Amendment law to this. And I didn't really have that much of an agenda because, as far as I knew, Nkosi didn't have a legal team. It was really just informational, wanting to get, a little bit of intel on what was going on in the field. And the other thing I reached out to her about was DC, where I've been living since I came here for law school, was considering a bill that would make prostitution legal in the district. Mm-hmm. And when I say prostitution, I don't mean the people actually in prostitution, because we actually support not criminalizing them, but pimping, brothel keeping, sex buying. And for those that don't know, DC is like a super divided city, both racially and socioeconomically. Mm-hmm. And so it was really just asking for abuse to be unleashed in the city. And so I had reached out also about if there's something I could do as a resident. And I was prepared. Prepared even to go to a protest, which is not my vibe, but I was willing to do it because I was pretty fired up about this. And my friend's response, their response was basically, can you send us your resume? And do you want to testify before City Hall?
Wow.
Of course, I sent my resume. I said, no, I do not want to testify before City Hall. That is not at all something that I'm interested in. But they persuaded me, and it was a chance for me to see their work and them in action, and for them to see me. And it's very funny. I ended up in an interview I didn't even know was an interview. And so within a few weeks, I had landed my dream job without even applying in a way that was completely unexpected. So
you know, what you said earlier, when you're in the midst of a path, you really don't know where you're going. You don't know where the Lord's leading you. But when you look back, you can see it more clearly. That was clearly evidence of the Lord leading you toward what you're doing today, which is really exciting to hear.
Yes.
So as someone who's really never been in the legal profession, hardly ever been in court, if I have been in court, tell our viewers what's a typical day for you in your role as a lawyer for your organization.
So a typical day for me actually doesn't involve court. I am not a trial attorney, so I do a lot of research and writing, which I like. And then some of it is interacting with clients. Some of it is doing some more academic writing that relates to the kind of work that we do. Occasionally, maybe reviewing a bill or helping with something relating to getting a law passed or reformed in some way. So it's a variety of things, but very much heavy on research and writing and collaboration with my team. Someone sent me a video, I don't know, a year or two ago, describing a lawyer as an attack librarian, and that really spoke to me. So that's what I do.
You're a little bit more behind the scenes than a typical lawyer. Then is that fair to say?
I don't think it's totally non-typical for civil litigation. I think criminal lawyers are in court all the time. Right. Certain kinds of trial lawyers are in court a lot more, but it's fairly normal. I mean, I would say, you know, we will have hearings in our cases occasionally, or I just argued an appeal at the Ninth Circuit a couple of months ago in a case. So we definitely have court appearances, but it's not like every day or every week.
So with that in mind, how does, I'll use the phrase court of public opinion, how does that weigh into what you're doing on a daily basis? I assume that's pretty powerful avenue.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, so NCOSE itself is not a legal organization. The Law Center is kind of a law firm embedded within it. Okay. So we have people doing more research or corporate social responsibility work or some of these different other areas. And so communication, so public advocacy is a huge part of what we do as a whole. And the lawyers do it as well, because we think it's really important for people to know both about what's going on and how much impunity there is for certain kinds of corporate wrongdoing, but also to know what they can do about it to protect themselves, their families, their communities, and how they can take action.
Okay. So in cases of sexual exploitation, is it possible for public perception and legal outcomes to influence one another as you're going through that process? Does that make sense?
Yes. Yes, I think so, especially in the legislative context, because it's often public pressure that causes legislators to act. Yeah. And so it's very, very, very important in that context. It's also important to have the public awareness so that people who are survivors and who want to pursue some kind of avenue for justice can know where to go and to know what their options are. So,
as a lawyer who has been doing this for a while, you've seen many different situations and experienced many different events. What are from your perspective, what are some of the biggest barriers to achieving justice for survivors of sexual exploitation?
Mm-hmm. I'll give like two. One is the first will be kind of specific and the other is more general. Maybe three. Okay. The first is a law from 1996, so 30 years old this year, called the Communications Decency Act, specifically Section 230, which is a law that basically has been interpreted to provide almost blanket immunity for websites for any kind of wrongdoing. So it makes them almost impossible to sue. Okay. We have had some success and we've had some challenges, which I can talk about more. But I would say that law, it just enables these websites that are aggregating a lot of abusive content that a lot of people are watching to make massive profits. And so they have no incentive to fix it. And they can just enable mass scale sex trafficking and sexual abuse and totally get away with it. So that's a big barrier. The second barrier, I would say, in a more general sense, is just indifference or a kind of, trying to think how to put it, a lack of moral imagination / conviction that enables people to see and act when maybe their role is not very direct. So they're enabling in some way. I mean, I would even say for a lot of these companies, these websites I just mentioned, they're more in that position. And just an enormous amount of damage is done by indifference.
Okay.
And then something that I think is related, the third thing is, in all candor, male entitlement. If men are not buying women for sex, and if they are not using pornography, all of this goes away tomorrow.
Yeah.
Like that's the only reason we have any of this. And a lot of times it really is motivated by indifference. There are some that are very like violent and harming someone else is the goal, like power is its own reward kind of thing.
Right.
Quite a lot of them just don't care. They don't care who they're hurting. They want what they want when they want it. And that's it. So those three things: Section 230, indifference, entitlement.
So maybe you'll touch on it here, but in researching more for this podcast today, I learned that you've worked on seeking injustice for survivors in prostitution in Nevada. What was the context of that case in Nevada that you were working on that brings that to a point today?
Yes. So we've had 2 cases in Nevada that argue a lot of the same things. The first one is on behalf of some survivors of different legal industries, legal brothels, a legal escort business, and legal strip clubs. And the second one just focuses on the brothels. So in Nevada, brothels are legal in rural areas, and they're extremely abusive. They lock the women inside. They charge them for every little thing. They fine them. They have to live on site and pay room and board. They have to give the brothel 50% off the top. Like, it's a system that ultimately results in a lot of women being in debt, and then being coerced by the fact that they're in isolated areas. Sometimes they're not even allowed to have a car on site. And so under federal law, if there's force, fraud, or coercion, or someone is a minor and they're subjected to a commercial sex act, that's sex trafficking. So the brothels are just blatantly sex trafficking. In one of our cases, the brothel was run by a county official, by a local county commissioner. So he was sitting at the time on his own brothel's regulation board, and very, very wealthy man, very powerful. And so we see there's definitely quite a lot of corruption in that context.
Yeah.
So we brought cases basically against both the government and the legal entities, saying that they're essentially together conspiring to profit from sex trafficking and violating the 13th Amendment against slavery and involuntary servitude. So in one of the cases, the government was dismissed. It's proceeding against the businesses. And then in the other, the government was dismissed, even though the government official was running the brothel. So we've appealed that. And then, and this is really shocking, we've never had this happen in a case before, but the judge, the federal judge, denied our client the right to be a Jane Doe, and basically said that it would be too prejudicial to the brothel's reputation if they had to defend themselves in the media, which is not a factor in the legal standard, without being able to name her. So they would get her name as part of like the discovery of the case. They just would have to keep it confidential. And there's like an organized crime element in this case. There are a lot of things that put her at pretty severe risk. Yeah. And the judge was like, but what's more important is the reputation of these brothels. So we've appealed that as well and are waiting to see.
So that's currently still going on.
Still going on.
That's unbelievable that the judge would protect the reputation of the brothels over the person, any person.
Yeah, any person. And she also, I mean, there was a hint in the language before we even got that ruling, because she referred to the brothel's debt bondage behaviors, actions as contract enforcement practices. Yeah. So already there was something going on there with how she was viewing this case. But
when I think of all what you just said and the situations you're in and the cases you're researching and you're working on, from a personal perspective, from a spiritual perspective, how do you stay focused, grounded, encouraged? Because you're working in a very dark space.
I, in this job in particular, spend a lot of time reflecting on Christ on the cross, because there is no evil that he has not seen.
True.
And taken into himself, onto himself, to triumph over it. And there's just sort of there's no suffering that he hasn't entered into, that he isn't present in. And so that's one kind of grounding reality. And then the other is that he's victorious. He is resurrected. He has conquered evil and death, and he is going to put everything right. And it doesn't land on me or on my team or on our allies or on the very courageous survivors that we represent, because he's going to put it right. He's not mocked, and he isn't going to allow these things to stand forever. And so I think that's something that we can rest in and have hope.
Yeah. And we can rest in that hope, whether you're caring for people who are being exploited or just we walk down the street with anyone. That's the truth. And that gives us hope. So thank you for sharing that. From a legal mindset, I believe the hands of justice can move slowly. Maybe you have a different opinion, but how do you stay motivated? I guess not. How do you stay motivated when things move so slowly that you want and change needs to take place?
Yeah. I mean, I think having some historical perspective is helpful, because that is often how change happens, like abolition of slavery in this country, a number of different efforts to reform prostitution. One thing I discovered in doing some research related to this job is that in much of the US, the age of consent was like 10 or 12 for a really long time. And then through just some very intense work by Christian feminists, I'll call them, it was raised to 16 in most states. And they wanted it to be 18. 16 was the compromise, but they just sort of banded together in the 1800s. There's a wonderful example of Black churches in DC and these evangelical women working together to raise it in DC in the 1800s. And they didn't even have the right, the women didn't even have the right to vote, but they were able to do this. They really just persevered. So I think having historical examples like that is very inspiring and encouraging, just knowing like you're playing the long game. It's going to take a while. And then sometimes the fall can happen so quickly. In 2019, Pornhub looked invincible. They had, I want to say, over 100 million visits to the site every month, blatant sex trafficking content, child pornography, horrific abuse, and obviously the most popular pornography site. And they looked invincible. And then the New York Times story came out and they started getting sued. We're part of a class action against them right now that has, like, it hasn't been dismissed. It's we've gone through discovery, like we've gathered the evidence basically showing they did what we said they would. They were doing. They've been investigated by the Canadian Parliament. They've been dropped, I think, by both Visa and MasterCard. Like, all of these things have happened, and they looked completely invincible 6 or 7 years ago. And so I think it's there are just many reminders of these people seem so powerful and so invincible until they aren't.
Yeah. Let's turn it a little bit and let's talk about some of the victories that you've experienced. So in your role here, what are some of those triumphs that bring you encouragement and joy, knowing that you had a role in making a difference?
Yeah. So if I could go back to actually our Pornhub case for a moment. So when we brought the case, it was very much a real possibility that the judge could use Section 230, that impunity law I mentioned, to find that Pornhub was immune in some way. And most cases, again, have not been successful against websites. It's just very, very, very hard to hold them accountable. They're becoming more successful, but in 2020, 2021, it was like there wasn't very much. And we got past what's called a motion to dismiss, which is what most defendants file as soon as you file a lawsuit to say, look, even if the facts in the complaint are true, there's no legal claim here. There's nothing, it doesn't matter if the facts are true. And a lot of cases end there. And so the judge in our case said two things. One, that Pornhub's own actions to like alter content so more viewers would see it by using titles and categories and tags and these kinds of things, meant that they couldn't be immune because they had participated, that they were essentially content creators themselves, instead of just the transmitter. And then the court also said that there is no such thing as immunity for possessing child pornography. It's contraband, it's federal crime, no one can have it. And the case proceeded. And then the next challenge, next big challenge, was whether it was going to be a class action. Also very hard. And we succeeded in that, which meant that it covered everyone in the US for a certain time period who had ever had any kind of child pornography or child sexual abuse material on the site. Every single person is covered that happened to. And Pornhub had to post a notice about that on the site, which was amazing. And so that case, given what we were up against, has been a huge victory and very, very encouraging, just for, I think, everyone who has been working on these issues. And then another kind of very recent and encouraging thing that's a little more indirect, but still amazing, is our team has been working with Meta for many, many years, trying to get them to do things to make the platform safer, like advising them, but also very much calling them out when they don't. And my colleague, Haley McNamara, was basically giving a deposition in a case brought by the state of New Mexico against Meta for child exploitation. It's maybe the first like it, I think. And Nkosi was basically deposed because of our knowledge and our attempts to get them to change things. And I got to defend that deposition. She did brilliantly, and her testimony was played for the jury, which was very, very powerful. And in that case, this happened, I think it was at the end of March. The jury issued a $375 million judgment against Meta. So game changer.
Game changer.
Again, because it hadn't happened before. So very encouraging.
Christen, I see our time is rapidly going away. I want to ask a few final questions. So I know the National Center on Sexual Exploitation has created a Dirty Dozen. What is the Dirty Dozen, and why is it important to share that with the public?
Yes. So every year, Nkosi releases the Dirty Dozen list, which is 12 companies, mainstream companies, that are committing or enabling sexual exploitation in some severe way. So there were a number of companies on it every year. We had Instagram on there. Instagram had a 17 strike policy for sex trafficking indicators. So if they saw something on the app or something was reported where an account was clearly trying to target a minor, because quite a lot of grooming happens on the app, they would let something happen 17 times before they would stop the account. Wow. Essentially. So it's things like that. And the idea is to help the public know what's going on so that they can call on the companies to do things differently, which often they do. We definitely have every year companies that are like, what we do is send out a letter with evidence telling the company you're going to be on the list this year. And sometimes they'll write back and be like, no, we don't want to be on the list. Like, we're going to do this.
I'm sure not.
So yeah, it's really about driving awareness, but for the purpose of reform so that they are motivated to change.
So I don't know if you can go into detail. I'll ask this question in a follow-up. So what are some companies that we may know that we may use every day that's on the Dirty Dozen? And how can people watching and listening to this program get a copy of that list?
Yes. So you can go to endsexualexploitation.org/Dirty Dozen list. And I'll just read a couple of them.
Okay.
Apple App Store. They have ratings, a rating system that basically misleads parents about the content and the risks for kids. And so that means kids can access apps they really shouldn't be accessing. Instagram, I already mentioned,
Right.
lots of grooming. Let's see here. Reddit is another one. Tons of child sexual abuse material, completely illegal content on there. OnlyFans, which we have a case actually against them where they were basically paying into the trafficker's bank account for all these different women's profiles. And they had everybody's bank information. So they knew they were only paying the one person for all these other profiles. Spotify has quite a lot of pornography on it. Twitter, if I could speak about Twitter for a moment, it has just so much child sexual abuse material on it. And we actually have been in litigation with them for several years. I say Twitter because it was called Twitter when we filed the case. But the two John Does in that case were induced to create pornography of themselves by someone they thought was their age. And it was a predator, and they were essentially extorted into doing it. And then someone put the video up on Twitter, which was just horrific. They found out about it, I think, from a classmate. And when they reported to Twitter, Twitter was like, we reviewed this. We don't think it violates our policy, so we're going to leave it up. Oh. And they just refused to take it down. And it got like almost 200,000 views. And then the family had a law enforcement connection who reached out and was able to get it taken down. But we sued Twitter, and we have basically kept losing for many years. Courts had been saying, no, Twitter is immune for this. They're immune for having child pornography on their site. They're immune for deliberately profiting from sex trafficking content. And sadly, last week, the Supreme Court rejected our petition for review. So we were very hopeful that the Supreme Court would give some clarity on this and some direction, because this is where the courts have been going. Anyway, so Twitter is on there for that reason.
Well, as you're going through these names, I mean, they're very common names. People who are listening to this know these companies. As you're saying it grieves my heart to hear all what's happening on social media, and it should grieve everyone's heart who's watching and listening to this program. So I want to encourage you to continue the fight and to do what's right. And you're doing a great work. And I want to encourage those watching and listening to pray for Christen in the National Center on Sexual Exploitation, because they're in the battle. They need our prayers. They need our support. And as the Lord brings them to mind, and Christen specifically to mind, please pray for them. Christen, let me ask you one final question. So what gives you hope that this work that you're doing, and what is one thing you wish more people would understand about survivors of sexual exploitation?
Well, if I could take the second one first,
Sure.
What is something I wish people knew about survivors, is that they're incredibly courageous.
Absolutely.
And even though, and trying to think how to put this, when they manifest things that are related to trauma, it's because their brain did what it was supposed to do to keep them alive in that situation. They're not crazy. They're not broken. They're not out to get you. And they should be believed and protected. But I think the courage is the thing that, more than anything, I want people to know. And then in terms of what gives me hope, I think in an immediate sense for these issues, it's just seeing the progress, seeing over the last 6 or 7 years the things that have changed, and even thinking about what was normal 100 years ago or 1,000 years ago. There's a time in this country where sex trafficking was perfectly normal and legal because it was practiced regularly as part of chattel slavery. And now that's unthinkable.
Yeah.
And that was just 200 years ago. And so taking the long view and really saying, like, things really can change. And then the second thing, the overarching thing that gives me hope is the reality that God is still on the throne, and one day he's going to end it for good.
He sure is.
It's going to happen.
Christen, hang in there. Keep looking to Jesus for your strength and your guidance, and keep up the good fight for what you're doing. Thanks for joining me this week on the Cedarville Stories podcast.
Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you for listening to the Cedarville Stories podcast, brought to you by Cedarville University. To learn more about Cedarville, visit our website at cedarville.edu or click on the link below in the show notes. Be sure to come back next week when we'll share another Cedarville story for God's glory.